This is the final session of our introduction to Noomakhia. I'd like to begin by reading to you from Volume 1, Chapter 9, which is the chapter on Cybele, the Black Logos. We have come to the study of the Black Logos, the most troubling section of our research. Let's recall how the original form of this hypothesis appeared. While working on the book In Search of the Dark Logos, and earlier in the books Logos and Mythos and Sociology of the Imagination, we tried to understand the nature of the crisis of contemporary Western Eurocentric civilization in its most fundamental philosophical foundations. Its crisis character is today evident to everyone or almost everyone. At least it is a commonplace for the majority of intellectuals. But opinions differ cardinally over its nature, cause, and structure. Following the most radical critics of Western modernity, among both traditionalists like Guénon, Evola, and Corbin, and more academic philosophers like Nietzsche, Heidegger, Jung, Bergson, Spengler, Sorokin, Durand, and others, we notice that we're dealing with the fundamental collapse of Western rationality, which was quickly splintering, becoming atomized, and creating the preconditions for the extreme irrational structure of postmodernity. We designated this process, Dugan writes, the fall of the light logos. European history and civilization began with the assertion of the importance of this logos in ancient Greece and Platonism. Following Heidegger and Nietzsche, we established the end of the initial logos, the collapse of Platonism and its echoes. But neither Nietzsche nor Heidegger were limited to just reporting the collapse or the fall, disintegration of this logos. They tried to understand the reasons for the end in its very beginning, in the beginning configuration of the logos itself, and to go beyond its borders in the direction of a new logos, which should be able to replace the collapsed old logos. Modernity, and especially post-modernity in this case, would represent not only the graveyard of the old logos, but also the problematic field of the coming of a new, alternative, other logos. Heidegger called this another beginning of philosophy. And let me just remind you that Dugan's first Heidegger book, translated into English, is Martin Heidegger, The Philosophy of Another Beginning. This idea of another beginning or another inception in Heidegger is important for Dugan just for this reason. Nietzsche, for his part, defined this alternative in terms of the philosophy of Dionysus. Jung and Durand tended toward the project of a return of Hermes. The traditionalists predicted the end of the Iron Age and the onset of a new golden age beyond it, though with a new humanity which should replace the old one that would be destroyed. Henri Corbin, we talked about a little bit, scholar of Iranian mysticism, identified the reasons for the fall of the West with the forgetting of the intermediary world and the fundamental ontological figure of the angel, whose epiphany should close the current cycle and open the following one. And Dugan also remarks about Spengler and about Bergson and Sorokin's predictions or expectations for what would come next. On the whole, he continues, these and many other authors gave Western civilization a fatal diagnosis. Its logos is irremediably ill and weakened and stands on the verge of inevitable death. In its place, there should come something radically other. And the book, In Search of the Dark Logos, was dedicated to precisely this, surveying the logos that is ending, the light logos, its structure, sources, history, and transformations, and at the same time attempting to clarify the other logos that might and should be its alternative. Applying Nietzsche's approach, Dugan writes, we continued to define the light logos as the logos of Apollo and to correlate it with Platonism. Heidegger reasoned in approximately the same way. Accordingly, Nietzsche also hinted at the direction of the search for an alternative in the direction of Dionysus, whose logos we call dark in contrast to the light logos of Apollo. Why dark? Because it's not as obvious, clear, transparent, and rational in the usual sense, but is rather secret, ambiguous, playful, and slippery, sometimes even giving the impression not of reason, but of its opposite, madness. Hence the theme of the connection of Dionysus with madness, his own madness, and the madness he provokes in his opponents and sometimes in his supporters. That, Dugin says, became the content for the work In Search of the Dark Logos and was the point of departure for Noomakhia. At the same time, in studying the relations of the light and dark Logoi, we came, he says, to the conclusion that Dionysian themes and topics in philosophy constantly intersect with the light logos of Apollo. Both Apollo and Dionysus are Olympian gods, which creates more complex constructions than the initial and often overly approximate versions of the descriptions of this pair, Apollo and Dionysus, but also that the Dionysian themes and topics overlap with another domain, which he says we gradually discovered not only as an object of thought to be considered from the position of Apollonian or Dionysian rationality, but also as another third logos, a maternal logos, the black logos of Cybele, symmetrically opposed in all things to the light logos, but qualitatively and fundamentally differing from the dark logos of Dionysus. Thus, we found ourselves in the tripartite topos of nous, intellect, which determined the plan of Noomakhia, between the pure light of Apollo and the pure blackness of Cybele, the zone of Dionysus, which is darker than the one, but lighter than the other. So that's a bit of what Dugin says at the start of this chapter about the path leading up to the discovery of the logos of Cybele. It's not just something he brought to the table at the outset. It's a discovery of the inquiry into the philosophical meaning of the crisis of Western rationality, and the discovery that this opposition between the Apollonian and the Dionysian wasn't sufficient to account for the variety of logos structures. Okay, I continue now from chapter 9. To speak of the logos of Cybele means to allow the possibility, to admit the possibility of the existence of underground philosophy, the philosophy of night. Here we can get, he says, significant help from the procedure that we used when studying the other two logoi. We saw that contrasting logos to myth was of relatively limited application, since this approach, the one that says myth is pre-rational and reason is the logical format of myths that represent a pre-logical stage, that initial view of the understanding of the relationship between philosophy and myth reflects only one possible way of looking back at the meaning of historical development, the progressivist one. But there are, as we know now, in Dugin's view, legitimate alternatives. Platonism, and especially Neoplatonism, he writes, is both logical and mythic to the same extent. It is philosophy and philomythia, science and theology simultaneously. We can't just bracket the mythical aspects as being pre-rational. So in other words, the transposability of myth and philosophy, which we talked about, that you can translate one into the other equivalently, or even as he writes here, the cyclical sequence, myth, logos. So instead of it just being a single line from myth to logos, it's a cyclical repetition of one by the other. This approach can help us gain access to the black logos, the logos of Cybele. In particular, Dugin suggests, we should consider myths connected with the earth, which would make sense given the basic geometry of the Logoi as he has set it out earlier. Apollo on Mount Olympus, Dionysus in the intermediary world, and that leaves the black logos for earth and the subterranean. So then we should consider myths connected with the earth and its personification as a mother goddess. Like the Anatolian goddess, Dugin chose to name the black logos Cybele. And so now here we transition to an account of the myth of Cybele, together with some of Dugin's commentaries on its meaning and significance. Cybele, also associated with the name Agditis, so here we treat them as so closely related for our purposes as to be one and the same. Cybele, also associated with the name Agditis, is born with two sexes. already this is a marker for Dugin of the Cybelean androgynous figure, whose unique feature is that in it, the male, okay, let me just take one step back. Dugin has a view that there's a typical androgynous being for the Apollonian logos, a typical androgynous being for the Dionysian logos, and a typical androgynous being for the Cybelean logos, even though predominantly he characterizes the Apollonian as male and the Cybelean as female and the Dionysian as intermediary. Each of them configures its gender relations on the basis of its own androgynous figure, tilted in one way or another, as we'll see in a minute. And when I say gender relations, for Dugin, that doesn't just mean whether men date women or other men. It means, of course, the whole set of correspondences to the ontologically female or male. For example, in his chapter on Gnosticism, he treats of the drama of Sophia. Sophia, who's built into the fabric of existence from its very beginning, but is understood as a feminine principle. And so he even traces among the Gnostics the creation of our world to an act of Sophia, who feels scorned by her inability to return once there has been a chain of creation. She wants to go back to the father of all things, but she's blocked from doing so by another one of his primordial creations, namely silence. So there's a whole ontological drama built into the Gnostic worldview. And the point is that Dugin interprets that as reflecting the presence of the feminine principle. So when he talks about male and female here, you have to understand more than just men dating women or other men. Cybele is born with two sexes, and in the unique configuration of the Cybelean logos, the male is feminized. That's crucial. The male is feminized, whereas in the Apollonian, the female is masculinized, as you see through Athena, warrior goddess, goddess of wisdom, and some other indications. So here the male is feminized, particularly through, as we will see, castration. In the Dionysian androgynous figure, there's a balance between the two sexes, which also means here between the divine and the earthly. And in the Apollonian, as I mentioned, the female is masculinized. To give you another example of that, in the intellectualization of the soul. So if the soul is feminine and the ascent of the soul, the intellectual ascent of the soul to the source of all things is unproblematic in Platonism, whereas it's problematic in Gnosticism, Dugin traces that to the gender feature also. Well, okay, the formula for the feminine-masculine relation in Cybele, as Dugin puts it, is the woman plus her sorrow for someone other than herself. And the female sorrow is distinct from masculine self-sufficiency and from various Dionysian alternatives. The female lack in the Cybelean cannot be satisfied. So as we return to the myth and Dugin's comments on it, some of that will begin to make more sense, unless you're already well familiar with this myth, in which case it might already be making sense. So Agditis is castrated. From the severed genitals grows the almond tree. The symbol of the Great Mother, Dugin comments, is the nut and especially the almond, which is a hieroglyph of the matrix of the world when represents the inverted female. Take it or leave it. I'm just telling you. So the world, which is, yes, inverted female. So we'll see. More generally, the tree as such, so from the castrated genitals, there grows a tree of some sort. So even if we set aside the significance of the almond, there grows a tree. And the tree as such is the symbol of the Great Mother. The tree is all that which grows from the earth, i.e., which is the earth's direct creation. The tree is autochthonous and springs from a given soil as the soil's manifestation. But while it grows upward to the sky, the tree remains always tied to its material basis. You might even think of it as trying to, at some stage, which he does in his analysis of Cybele, at some stage trying to break with its material basis, but not truly and not effectively. As he puts it elsewhere, no matter how high the tree grows, it never reaches the sky, properly speaking, ontologically speaking. So The tree is the female principle with pretensions to masculinity. This idea that the logos of Cybele sometimes is a pretender to something higher than herself is an important part of Dugin's analysis. He says, if you remember the discussion last session about the differentiation of Dionysiae, so there's more than one Dionysus, more than one intermediary figure, he says that Cybele produces her own, how can we put this? Her own version of a Dionysus, her own black double of Dionysus, who tricks us into believing that she's aiming for a pathward up to the Apollonian through this mediator. But as we'll hear more about as we go through this myth, it never works out well for that black double of Dionysus, and the ascent is always ultimately frustrated. Another point Dugin makes about the connection of Cybele and the tree, now doing a slight translation into or transposition, I should say, into the philosophical, is that the Greek word for matter in Aristotle, hule, had the Latin equivalent silva, which meant woodland or forest. So the materialism of Cybele is illustrated using the mythical connection between the Great Mother and the tree, mediated through the linguistic relationship between the matter and the tree. So you see, you get a configuration now of mythic and philosophical elements linking the Great Mother to materialism through the figure of the tree and the Greek and Latin words for matter. We discussed last session, somebody brought up the point about a passage in political Platonism, in the conversation about Noomakhia in political Platonism, where Dugin discusses this issue of matter, the black logos, and the tree. And I'd like to read that passage to you before we continue on with the myth. Matter, he writes, is etymologically like the Greek hule, timber. That is an Aristotelian term. Semantically, it means the lower limit of bodily forms, that which is lower than the elements from out of which corporeality or bodiness is woven. The tree is the symbol of the Great Mother. The tree is a trick. It's an optic ontological illusion. It seems to the observer that the tree grows from the earth, which produces it from itself. But the tree grows from the seed, not from the earth. Consciousness of the role of the seed, Dugin writes, is the beginning of patriarchal philosophy, the cult of the father and son. Incidentally, anti-patriarchy may be why you're no longer allowed to refer to something important as being seminal, or not. Well, earth is important, he continues, but it does not give things being. Earth, in a philosophical sense, is sterile. It is the milieu, but not the bearing impulse. It does not give things being. It accepts a small being, the seed, and helps it have its fill of juices, feeds it, like the wet nurse or Cora in Plato's dialogue, the Timaeus. That is a solar relation to matter, which itself does not exist like the seed exists, and does not give things being. But in matriarchal cultures, among peoples of the sea and certain Western Semites, there is the idea of the birth-giving earth, matter as possessing being and granting being. This being of the earth is embodied in the tree, in timber. The tree is a seal of the being of the earth. Imagined being, he adds in parentheses, for Indo-Europeans. In other words, Indo-Europeans do not treat matter as having being in this way. That is the words hule and the Latin materia, matter. The philosophy which understands the world from below and explains the higher through the lower, that's the logos of Cybele. She understands the world from below and explains the higher through the lower. And by the way, some of you watching this, for some of you, that phrase will have additional meaning about explaining the higher through the lower, or rather seeing the high in light of the low and not the low in light of the high. Well, the Great Mother, that's how she sees the world. And that's the chain of homologies, he writes. This is page 72 and 73 of Political Platonism. That is the chain of homologies leading from myth to philosophy, but one can move along it also in the opposite direction. Back to the myth now. So Nana, the daughter of the god of rivers, eats this almond. Remember, you have Agditis, Cybele Agditis, born in the way we've described, castrated. There grows the almond tree, and Nana, the daughter of the river god, comes along and eats the almond. And lo and behold, she conceives and bears Attis. Sometime having passed, Agditis Cybele meets Attis and falls in love with him, trying to restore the initial androgynous status, unsuccessfully. And Dugin writes that this comprises the drama of the Black Logos, which repeats its fundamental cycle time and again. The structure of the Black Logos is the always unsuccessful striving to return itself to original strength in response to what it has suffered, castration here, from the Apollonian. So it loses a war, it loses a battle, it loses part of itself, it tries to return to a state of integrity. It is frustrated from satisfying that goal. It can't do so successfully. Cybele, Dugin notes in passing, thus also symbolizes the revolutionary uprising of the slaves, a tonic or underground love that aims to restore an original order. Okay, Attis. So remember, Attis is the person, the man who's born when Nana eats the almond that grows from the castrated genitals of Agditis. Attis tries to break away from the matriarchal order, and he tries to find himself a legitimate marriage to, let's say, a normal family. He wants to break from this whole crazy past, and he wants to find a legitimate marriage in a non-matriarchal order, and he's on the verge of doing so when what else should happen but he's interrupted at the altar by Cybele, who makes Attis go insane. Insanity, by the way, Dugin writes, is a distinguishing feature of the Black Mother. It is her weapon, and it's a specific Cybelean madness. The other Logoi, as we've mentioned throughout, have their own madness. In Apollo, it's the contemplation of the one beyond being, for example. So there's a close link between Dionysus and Cybele and both of their madness, but still, Cybele bestows on Attis this madness. In his insanity, what do you think he does? That's right, he castrates himself. So that's the second castration. You have the castration of Agditis, then you have the castration of Attis. And the second castration frustrates Attis's effort to get outside the matriarchal order, as you can imagine, just as it frustrates Cybele's love and desire for Attis, for that initial integral wholeness. In commenting on the castration of Attis, Dugin says that it signifies at least the following three things. Number one, that the male part of Cybele is prevented by Cybele herself from acquiring an independent masculine ontology, with all that entails. Secondly, the gods curse the feminine androgynous being and prevent the uprising of its initial power. And that refers to the initial castration of Agditis. That's not self-castration. That's not a self-inflicted wound. That comes from elsewhere. And he says that in some myths, that act of castration is even attributed to Apollo. And the third point is that the feminine androgynous being triumphs as a closed, absolute sadness of matter that tries to go beyond its own limits only to return to the total power of its powerlessness. Triumph is probably not the right word there, but you see a closed loop that is never gets beyond its own ambit here. Well, as Dugin writes in Political Platonism, summarizing the Cybelean cycle, the Great Mother parthenogenetically produces from herself the male alter ego, which it falls in love with and takes delight in, but which it later castrates and kills, returning to the bottomless darkness of its desperate and insatiable female privation. And here we can begin to shift from the mythical formulations and commentaries on them to the conceptual side of things. Cybele is, as you saw through the linguistic tree of the word tree, or the relationship between matter and woodland, Cybele is materialism. Matter exists, and it is the truth, and only it exists. Everything else is non-being and lies, asserts the black logos of Cybele, as Dugan writes. So now, Cybele being matter, we have to see what Dugan says about materialism. Well, in a moment, I'm going to read to you the 20 points, it's a numbered list of 20, that he makes about the philosophy of the black logos in his chapter on Cybele. Incidentally, as far as I know, that chapter hasn't been translated, and so I'm giving you something new here. I want to first make one more of Dugan's points about how we should think of modernity and the black logos. So this is also something that's come up throughout the sessions, where modernity is somehow the attack of the Titans against the Apollonian world, and we should therefore see what Dugan says more concretely about the relationship between modernity and the black logos of Cybele. So if you remember, we discussed earlier that for Dugan, modernity is not so much a period of time in a linear history. Like you have the pre-modern, you have the Middle Ages, you have modernity, and you have where, you know, you've passed through a period of time to modernity, and now we're just going to go forward. There's no turning back the clock. We talked about that for Dugan, modernity is not a period of time in a linear history, so much as it is an ever possible structure within the wars of Nous. In his chapter on Cybele, he says that the idea that materialism is modern and that the other logoi are pre-modern and outdated is part of the propaganda of the black logos. Well, if Dugan is right that myths can be transposed into philosophy, and that the Cybelean myths can be identified with the philosophy that we know best in modernity, that would be evidence for his claim, since the myths precede historical modernity. In other words, if we take the myths, which are pre-modern, and transpose them, I mean, they're pre-modern if we take the linear temporality, they fall outside of the onset of modernity, they're ancient. So if we take those myths and transpose them into philosophy, and the result is a plausible version of modern philosophy, that would indicate that structurally modern world configuration was present before the period we know as modernity. Well, for Dugan, modernity is present wherever the black logos is. It doesn't just and the black logos is an eternal possibility in Noomakhia. Therefore, modernity is an eternal possibility in Noomakhia. In Political Platonism, on page 70, he makes the point this way. In some sense, the materialism of modernity consisted in a rediscovery of pre-Socratic atomism and a number of Epicurean doctrines, through Lucretius in particular. That is, tradition and the modern, the contemporary or modern, should be understood synchronously as types of philosophy, culture, and society. The modern era is the era of the temporary triumph of the Titans and the Great Mother. And that's, sometimes they triumph, sometimes they don't. In chapter 9, Dugan writes a lot about Lucretius and Epicurus, Democritus also. And I just wanted to say in passing about the idea that the rediscovery of ancient atomists like Lucretius shows that modernity has an ancient basis. About that idea, I want to say the following, that when the German scholar of the history of political philosophy, Leo Strauss, was considering the issue whether there was liberal democracy in antiquity, which we can rephrase in our terms as whether modernity is a qualitative break with antiquity in time, or a structural difference that exists at all times, and that therefore may be found in the ancient world, as Dugan asserts. When Strauss was examining that question, he also turned to the study of Lucretius. But he found that Lucretian, and more broadly ancient liberalism, was fundamentally distinct from modern liberalism. And you might want to read Strauss's argument about that in the book of essays called Liberalism, Ancient and Modern, which has a chapter on Lucretius, as a point of contrast with Dugan's arguments. I mention that only in passing to indicate the possibility of a comparison between Dugin and Strauss on this issue, since I know some of the people who will be watching this would pursue that type of project. So now I'd like to read to you the 20 principles of Black philosophy, as Dugin calls it in chapter 9 on Cybele. So without further ado, the 20 principles of Black philosophy. Number 1, at the basis of everything lies matter. Hule, Silva, wood, space, Cora, the wet nurse from the Timaeus, the proto-matter. The first thing is matter. It lies at the basis of everything. Point 2, matter understood maximally broadly, that means logically, mythologically, philosophically, theologically, religiously, ritually, symbolically, and genderly, or with respect to gender. Matter understood in that most broad sense is identical with being and imbues all the phenomena arising from it with being. Again, principles of the Black philosophy. 3, matter possesses creative power and can create from itself bodily forms and life streams. The being of matter is transformed into life and into eidetic constructions. Eidetic means the ideas, the forms, the principles of things. So there are like more general conceptual entities, but they stem from and are the products of the creative power of matter. Matter is the creator of all. Point 4, the world is material, created from matter and returning to it. Matter is the alpha and omega of existence. So all things arise from matter and they return to matter. 5, things develop, beginning from being maximally material and leading to more eidetic forms, all the way up to pneuma, the spirit, and intellect or consciousness, as he also puts here. But intellect and consciousness, that's nothing other than the crown of the autonomous work of matter. Point 6, time is material, linear, and infinite. It flows in one and the same direction, but this flow has no goal. It flows like Titan ocean, always in one direction, but never reaching a goal. It has no goal. Matter develops and progresses, but always remains itself while constantly changing. That's all under point 6. Point 7, the materiality of the spirit is the highest secret of true knowledge. All forms have a common denominator: tonic chaos, underground chaos, subterranean chaos. Appeal to it allows one to die and resurrect, to accomplish transformations and transubstantiations. Spirit is a consequence. It is always relative. Only matter is absolute. And that is true gnosis, freeing the knower from the oppression of diuretic operations, like philosophical diuresis. Everything, point 8 now, is its own opposite. Differences are never absolute, so transition to the side of the opposite camp, betrayal and transgressions are basic operations of the Black Logos, which is characterized by radical euphemism and antiphrasis. Everything is its own opposite. Point 9, everything is constantly changing and constantly remains itself. The forms change, the eidoses or configurations, but the materiality stays the same. Elements transition into one another, but preserve a connection with the original ontological base, matter itself. And again, here we said that time has no goal. Well, changes, especially movement, also have no goal. Point 10, matter is many. Quantity, quantitas. Matter is quantity. There is only the many. The one can emerge as a product of the game of the many and can just as easily disappear. quantity is prior to quality. And here, let me just say in passing that in political Platonism, there's a chapter on the Parmenides where Dugin does an analysis of the one and the many and what it means for the many to be primary and for the one to be a creation of the many and so on. And he mentions that from time to time in this chapter also. I just say it in passing. I don't think we'll have time to look at it in detail now, but if you want to know more about how he thinks about the one and the many, you'll have to see that chapter there. Maybe we will turn to it if we do have time. So that was point 10. Matter is quantity, which is prior to quality. Point 11, the priority of quantity is also stated as the many, is expressed in the fact that there originally exist only atoms. Between them is emptiness, or the void. This atomization is necessary for the many to be many and not one, if we admit the indivisibility of matter. Point 12. All bodies and also souls and spirits consist of atoms. They're comprised of atoms and decompose into atoms, some more quickly, others more slowly. Next, their materiality makes all things equal. Everything is equally dust and vanity. Point 14. Things and entities constantly attack one another in a battle for matter as the highest value. Everyone tries to tear everyone apart, breaking them into quantity. Everything breaking down into atoms to be recombined again. 15th point. Possession of food, riches, things, and resources, for instance, is the meaning and goal of being. Matter fights with matter for matter. Well, we can say, remember that, if we take the earlier point seriously, matter, strictly speaking, has no goal, and yet somehow culminates in desire for the possession of food, riches, things, resources, and so on. Matter fights with matter for matter. There you have the alpha and omega, and even the middle. Point 16. Worshipping material, studying material or matter, submitting to matter. People who are created by matter, for matter, give eternal praise to matter by their materiality and participation in material cycles. In other words, matter is all-encompassing, and we worship it, study it, submit to it, created by it, we live for it, and we praise it in our own materiality and our participation in material cycles. Point 17 of the 20 points of the philosophy of the Black Logos. Everything existing as something, so not nothing, evokes a smile. And Dugin refers throughout this chapter to the smiling atomists. Everything is funny, since the form, the thing that presents itself as a form in a thing, it forgets its materiality. It takes itself too seriously when it thinks that it's something other than matter. It holds itself forth as its opposite, and that's funny. And in this world, the stupid are smarter than the smart, the ugly is more beautiful than the beautiful, and monstrous matter is more dear than the perfected, completed being. There's all kinds of inversions there, and the atomistic philosopher can't take anything seriously. He sees through to its material basis, and that evokes in him a smile. Point 18. That which is closer to matter and not further from it is more real. You know that in the allegory of the cave in Plato's Republic, as you ascend towards the natural light of the sun, leaving the cave and no longer taking the shadows on the wall for reality, you get closer and closer to reality. Things become more real the further away you get from matter in an active intellectual ascent. Well, in the Black philosophy, the further you get from matter, the less real you are, and the closer you get to matter, the more real things are. That which is closer to matter is more real. And again, for the benefit of those Strauss readers among you, I know there are a few, this can remind you of Leo Strauss's statement that in modernity, we're no longer in the situation of natural ignorance, which is where the enchained slave is in Plato's cave allegory. He sees the shadows on the wall and takes them for reality, but there is an education that will liberate him from that condition. While Strauss, following Plato, says that's our natural state. We naturally take the shadows as reality, but can go to reality through education. Strauss says that in modernity, we're no longer in Plato's cave. We're no longer in the natural condition. We are in a cave beneath the cave, which means we have to ascend just to return to a natural condition where education, philosophical education, is possible. And maybe somehow we can see Dugin's methodological suggestions at the start of this volume as getting out of the cave beneath the cave to make becoming Platonists possible. But it also suggests a mythological affinity between Strauss and Dugin on the subterranean nature of modernity. Point 19, between the world of material bodies and matter itself are infinitely many worlds. They are full of dark and powerful life. The unformed, incomplete, imperfect, and disfigured is more powerful, massive, stronger, and ontologically well-formed than the completed, finished being. So in the Black Logos, not only is everything material, and not only is there an infinity of worlds between the material bodies and matter itself, that world full of strange giants and monsters and unusual creatures, and here a head and there a leg and there a some other thing that doesn't seem to belong. All of that is more real than the perfected. To put it simply, the freak show is to be preferred to the beautiful, noble, Apollonian figure of the completed, perfected body and soul. The freak show philosophy. Point 20, materiality is that which is obvious or evident in all that is present. So I think the restatement here is more clear. All that exists is material. Well, that we've covered. But matter itself loves to hide. It is always one level lower. And he ends his 20th point, with the following injunction: seek matter. So for the Black Logos, not only is everything material, but you have to get into that infinity of worlds where there's always going to be a layer down, a layer down, a layer down, as you try to unveil bare matter. Dugin's 20 points about the philosophy of the Black Logos speak often of matter, as you have heard. Well, he says that we also could have spoken of nature. Nature, as Heraclitus said, loves to hide, and it hides behind a veil. When we try to unveil nature, we run a fundamental philosophical risk. Mythologically stated, Cybele kills and castrates her lovers, those who try to get too close to her. Parenthetically, I add that another point on castration and the Black Logos that Dugin makes is that maybe when we speak about the Black Logos, we're talking about a masculine reconstruction of Cybele. Because he says, how can there be a logos of Cybele? Somehow logos itself, whether we talk about the Apollonian, the Dionysian, or the Cybelean, somehow the logos aspect itself seems to be masculine. So he says, maybe we're talking about a masculine reconstruction of Cybele if we believe there's a connection between logos and the masculine. Well, how can there be a masculine logos reconstruction of Cybele that is faithful to her? You see the problem? If she's the great mother, if she's the female, and if it requires, and if we're trying to impart to her a logos, but the logos is a masculine reconstruction, aren't we conflicting between the masculine and the feminine here? Well, Dugin says that the philosophical reconstruction, the philosophical masculine reconstruction in Logos of Cybele is possible if it is the reconstruction not of the male simply, but of the castrated male. The Great Mother had a cult of sacred castration devoted to her. And according to Plotinus, the Neoplatonist, as Dugin interprets him, commenting on chapter 19 of the third Ennead, the castrated male is even more a sign of the inability to bring something forth than the figure of the woman is, making the castrated male a good symbol for the Black Logos. So, as we were saying, Cybele kills or castrates those who try to get too close to her. The Apollonian Platonic masculine Logos would never even want to look behind the veil of nature, since it doesn't grant matter its own ontological status at all. And since for the Neoplatonists, you can only truly know something with your eyes closed, as Dugin says, citing one of them, which means through supra-sensual intellectual assent. You have to be blocking the material world out to get to the truth. So why would you be trying to peek beyond the veil, behind the veil of nature towards naked matter? Well, you don't in the Apollonian Logos. Knowledge of nature granted by nature herself, nature unveiled, is not only dangerous but false on the Apollonian view. When nature grants her secrets to the philosopher, if she does, she dispatches him to hell, which no Apollonian philosopher wants to go there. The Dionysian Logos comes closer to the veil of nature, but when we are on the side of the Black Logos, Dugin writes, we're beyond the veil altogether. And Dugin distinguishes terminologically between nature and matter, calling nature matter's external side. But under the veil of nature, we discover the secret and horror of the connection between the surface and the depths of the earth, their material unity. You know, it's horrible, but again, it makes the philosophers of the Black Logos smile. And that discovery shows us that earthly life is another form of being of subterranean death. So we see there that we peek behind the veil of nature, or the veil of Isis, which is how he puts it since he's relying on Pierre Hadot's book by the same title. Peek behind the veil of nature, the veil of Isis, and we are faced with the truth of naked matter. I would say that if you combine what we have briefly covered as the mythological side of Cybele, the importance of castration, of frustration, of attempted reunification, the inability for that to be accomplished, if we combine that through the figure of the tree and its relationship to matter with the 20 points of Black philosophy, I think that will give us enough of an indication of the Cybelean Logos for our purposes in the context of this introduction to Noomakhia. The chapter itself is something like over 100 pages. It wouldn't be feasible to go through all the details, but I think that alongside the Apollonian and the Dionysian, which we discussed last session, that gives us roughly, a good first approximation of the meaning of the Cybelean Logos in the methodology of Noomakhia. The only other thing I want to say about it before moving on to the next part of our session is that for Dugin, the Black Logos of Cybele is not some kind of exotic construction, which you might think it is because you know and probably have heard Apollo, Dionysus. You may not have, but for many of you, that basic dyad will be roughly familiar. But when he puts Cybele on the table and the Black Logos and castration, what are you talking about? It could seem like something of an exotic construction. But he says it isn't one. Rather, it's the matrix of consciousness of modern man. We are materialists. We interpret the world instantly and spontaneously as matter, more likely than not. Our automatic world interpretation is today Cybelean, according to Dugin. So we shouldn't treat it as something so unusual. In fact, we should try to see how it describes modern man. and postmodern man. So much for this outline of the Black Logos. If you remember from the first sessions, our introduction to Noomakhia is dealing primarily with the initial chapters of volumes 1 and 2, which are themselves the methodological, philosophical foundations of the 20-plus volume endeavor, as Dugin himself states explicitly. We went through the introduction in chapter 1 on the 3 Logoi, and as you see, we've gotten some handle of the differences between the Apollonian, the Dionysian, and the Cybelean. Their mythical and philosophical sets of correspondences, the possibility of transposition, and all of that. And so I thought we would use the rest of our time together to cover very briefly some of the relevant methodological comments from volume 2 of Noomakhia, which you're looking at right here. The vertical topography of the 3 Logoi, Dugin writes, can be envisioned as a perpendicular angle constructed upon and penetrating each geographical, or more precisely geocultural and geosophical zone of the world. So here we begin with the vertical Logoi that we've distinguished as light, dark, and black, now penetrating the horizontal dimension, the geocultural, geopolitical, geosophical dimension. Every cultural space, cultural, historical type, or civilization, by definition, Dugin writes, can possess Apollonian, Dionysian, or Cybelean dimensions as 3 dimensions of its cultural space. And here he gives us our first correspondence. So its dimension of height could be the light Logos, its dimension of breadth could be the dark Logos, and its dimension of depth would be the black Logos. We say can, he hastens to add, for this does not mean that each of these Logoi will necessarily be present, much less predominate. So the 3 Logoi can configure the heights, depths, and breadth of a civilization, but we don't know yet in what proportions and whether one of them may be absent altogether. The diversity of cultures and societies on Earth, he writes, lies in the fact that every culture and every society presents its own kind of projection of the 3 vertical Logoi in different proportions and different relations. By the way, implicit, I think, and explicit even in some other seminars or some other sessions in this seminar, is my view that Dugin's study of civilizational multipolarity is a richer and truer attempt at describing diversity. It's a more meaningful diversity than what we normally take in a liberally dominated discourse as diversity. So you may want to keep that in mind also and see, I'd like to know whether you disagree or not. So the diversity of cultures and societies on Earth lies in the fact that every culture and every society presents its own kind of projection of the 3 vertical Logoi in different proportions and different relations. You might have thought the diversity was just in food tastes, okay, or in skin color, if you followed superficial analyses as opposed to fundamental ones. Well, one of the Logoi might dominate in one place while the others remain in a virtual state. And elsewhere, the picture can be more complex. The 3 empires of the Logoi, and here I can tell you that at the end of volume 1, he introduces this metaphor of the Logoi being empires. The 3 empires of the Logoi are projected onto each culture, not only in terms of this geometrical schema, vertical, horizontal, but always also from different angles. So suddenly we have this new variations and complexities, fractal, chaotic, as you remember from elsewhere. So also from different angles, just as one and the same projected image can, taking into consideration different folds, curvatures, breaks, dips, etc., yield different shapes on different surfaces. So our first approximation, simplification, 3 Logoi, Apollo, Dionysus, Cybele. Then we get their own nuanced interactions and relationships and internal and external relations with one another, that whole dramatic interplay. Now we add, again in a simplification, the vertical and the horizontal, and we include on the horizontal all of the subtleties, not non-Euclidean space, folds, curvatures, and all the rest of it. And you can already see, without me having to get there, although I will read the passages to you, that ultimately you should have here an inexhaustible complexity. But we begin with the simplest model and proceed gradually. When reflected upon the sea, he writes, the sun's rays are transformed from straight lines into curved lines, and their constancy gives way to a rhythmically repetitive sinusoid. Light disappears on a dark surface. It's reflected in a mirror, and so on. In other words, if we add to this understanding the fact that cultural fields are not strictly horizontal in relation to a noetic topology, but are themselves reflected at these certain angles which differ from culture to culture, then we can appreciate and estimate just how diverse and multidimensional cultural geography can be, just how multifaceted the field of Geosophy is. And as follows, we can appreciate the richness of anthropological pluralism. The very identification of the presence of the three Logoi and the discernment of the dramatic war between their empires fundamentally enriches our understanding of the structures of Nous, imparting to them vital and intense volume. Taking into account the diversity of the projections onto the horizontal plane of human cultures, which these Logoi and Noomakhia can yield, turns the whole picture into a grand panorama of qualitative intellectual plurality, a fertile and substantive pluriverse. I don't know whether I have it in my notes, but I was rereading this chapter and the conclusion of volume 2 before meeting today. And Dugan says here, it's almost no surprise if you take into account the complexity that he has just outlined. He says it's almost no wonder that nobody has undertaken such a study. And he says repeatedly throughout these methodological works that we're barely going to be scratching the surface. And you know, we spoke last session that the 24 volumes can be a table of contents for 240. So Dugan emphasizes time and again the richness of the phenomena here. The blossoming complexity. He continues as follows. In the first book of Noomakhia, we primarily occupied ourselves with the vertical symmetries and oppositions of noology, as well as the philosophies and mythologies that express them. We're familiar with that now, I think. Now we shall transition to horizontal symmetries and approach the study of the diversity of the Logoi among civilizations and cultures. In the following books of Noomakhia, we intend to present a number of developed illustrations of how the Logoi independently and distinctly manifest themselves in the most distinct and different civilizations, both those close to Europe and those that are distant from it. This qualitatively complicates the overall picture of noology. We will see how, in addition to or beyond the war of the three empires, the oppositions and conflicts between them are projected onto the horizontal plane, as well as the internal polycentrism and historical dynamics inherent to these projections. So we haven't even added the temporal dimension yet, but he alludes to it here. So not only do you have the projection of the Logoi onto a complex space, you also have the temporal dynamism and internal polycentrism. Well, this will explain many aspects of inter-civilizational relations and intercultural ties, but still the resultant field of Geosophy will present itself as an extremely complex model, even in its merely static structure, without taking into account temporal dynamics, whether cyclical or unilinear. Taking into consideration the dynamic changes in cultural systems, which are organized along primordially different lines and represent a field of intense battle between the three noetic empires, promises to transform history, philosophy, religious studies, anthropology, and cultural studies into such a complex picture, simultaneously containing, this is the passage that I was telling you about earlier, here you can see exactly what he says, simultaneously containing such a multiplicity of layers and levels that it should come as no surprise why no one has undertaken such a study before. After all, the hands of the most courageous and resolute scholar can waver in the face of such an abundance of materials and the sheer quantity of relevant factors. Thus, this is an important point, all previous undertakings that no matter what pursued something similar, somehow similar to what he's suggesting here, will become valuable to us. In other words, any even rough approximation to the study of civilizational multipolarity is useful for Noomakhia, which is why half of volume 2, roughly, consists of a survey of contributions spanning from such figures as Proclus and Joachim de Flore to Freud, Jung, Eliade, Huntington, and others. To be exact, there are 37 chapters dedicated to 37 authors who somehow offer concepts relevant to Geosophy. I'm not going to read all of them to you, but I have something just to show you in passing, and I will mention a few of the names. So Proclus, as I said, Vito, Herder, Schelling, Hegel, Danilevsky, Ratzel, Mackinder, Carl Schmidt, Spengler, Franz Boas, Dernwald, Frobenius, Hermann Wirth. Incidentally, that chapter 22 on Hermann Wirth, I emailed out the link where you could find English translations to the introductory chapters here. That chapter 22, is translated, so you can get a sense of how Dugin pulls on some of these authors. It's the only one in this section that is translated, but you can go have a look if you'd like. And then there's also, as I said, Evola, Guanon, Eliade, Jung, Freud. Someone had asked me about here on the id, on eros and thanatos, society and the primordial drama, and on the meaning of Freud's ideas for Geosophy. Okay, that's chapter 26. And once he has completed his survey of those authors, Dugin produces a chart of the general nomenclature of basic terms. Because remember, he's looked at all of these authors to see that they contribute something to geosophical and noological studies. And he has a couple of charts here. So I haven't, in my initial thoughts for this course, I considered translating this whole thing for you. But right now, let me just indicate it. So here you have, and I'll put this up to the camera in a minute. You have, if this says morphology on this side, logos, civilization, culture, existential horizon. And on the bottom, sorry, yeah, this is the author that he's referring to, these 37 different authors, and what terms they used for culture, civilization, the existential horizon, and the logos. Okay, and this goes on, because I told you he's got to cover 37 authors. And then he has another table, which goes on and on for many pages, as I can show you here. You see, pages and pages of this table. And what this table is it shows you here. Here's the author of the theory. Then the name of the main unit. So for example, in Heidegger, the name of the main unit is Dasein. The number of civilizations in Dasein, he's got only one for Heidegger, Western Greco-Roman civilization. And you know, because we've discussed it here, that Dugin has the thesis of the plurality of Daseins, because he says, or if you raise the number of civilizations past one, which is implicit in civilizational multipolarity, then you would need to have a multiplicity of Daseins, a task he accomplishes in his second Heidegger book. Then you have here phases. So what are the phases of history according to that particular author? Well, we've discussed that for Heidegger. You have the history of being from its pre-Socratic beginning to its end in Nietzsche. Then, what is the key metaphor? I don't know if you can see that. I apologize if it's not coming through clearly. What's the key metaphor for this author? What's the vector of development, the meaning of gender in civilization, the fate of Western civilization, and as a matter of specific interest to Dugin, as someone who's concerned for Russia's future and as a theorist of Eurasianism, he includes as one of the important features here, what is the function of Eurasia in this theorist's model? And as it happens, just leaving things with Heidegger, Russia has a fundamental ontological significance for Heidegger that Dugin has written about elsewhere and that I've written about elsewhere in my essays on Dugin's Heideggerianism. So 37 authors go through this geosophical, terminological comparison to try to establish the parameters using all the available resources of a systematic geosophical dimension of Noomakhia. Not Not for the faint of heart, quite interesting, and I think worthy of some respect. I return now to the notes. 37 chapters, 37 authors, and the two tables. Horizontality in itself, Dugin writes, is multidimensional and polycentric. It harbors not only the static layers of culture that are discernible independently of time and which constitute the structure of permanent identity, but also historical dynamics over the course of which the very proportions of the relations between these layers dialectically change. So it's not like civilization is not always one configuration of the logoi. There's a dynamism, there's a pulse, and there's a rhythm, and there's a war. Thus, in each and every civilization, we must inscribe history into the unchanging synchronic model of identity, as well as situate space in the structure of civilizational time. So this is an introduction to Noomakhia. We're not going to do all of that, but it's important for you to understand what Dugin thinks is required by this undertaking. And he writes here, because you remember that although there are all of these theorists who have something to contribute, he has said in the introductory section of Volume 1 that Heidegger is of particular importance. And you may know from the fourth political theory, and if you don't, I'm telling you now, that Dugin has said Heidegger is the deepest foundation of the fourth political theory. So Heidegger somehow has a privileged status among all of the resources for civilizational multipolarity. And accordingly, I think, Dugin draws on Heidegger, which we will talk more about in a few minutes. But here, when he says that being unfolds as space and surges into existence, making it present. Space he interprets as living space, the space of the people. Time also is an opening, revelation, or discovery. Space and time form a common but differentiated horizon of ontology based on a fundamental trauma, that of the breaking, splitting, the glaringness of the abyss of the primordial differential. Here I can only indicate to you in passing, those of you, if this has no, if you don't understand it, you don't care to understand it, then that's fine. But those of you who do, I offer for your benefit that Contributions to Philosophy of the Event, a work by Heidegger, as well as the Event and other middle period writings that are important to Dugin, do have sections where they deal with the fundamental ontology of space and time. So if you're trying to understand what that might mean for Dugin theoretically, those would be good places to look if you're looking outside of Dugin's own writing. So time and space, which is to say the dynamism and stasis of every culture, thought of as surging into existence and as somehow revelatory of being, they together comprise the intertwined edges, as he writes, of a common semantic horizon, which we can conceptualize as a horizon only by force of the fact that we're examining it in light of the noological vertical of the three logoi. In and of itself, a horizon is not flat, but simultaneously contains several dimensions, both spatial and temporal. In other words, to guard us once again against an oversimplification even of the term horizon, Dugin is reminding us that we have a fundamental ontology of space and time built into that very dimension. Well, we can envision the structure of this horizontal topology, which is of priority interest to us in this work, he says, as a spatial temporal whole. If we evaluate it from one perspective, it can be seen as a qualitative space or a living space, a space, not a space in which you live, like your living room, but a space which is itself alive, a field which harbors events and meanings, spatial meaning. Okay, all of this is important for Dugin. The idea of that space itself has a meaning, space itself has this, is understood not just as some abstract set of coordinates in which things take place, but the coordinates themselves lack any meaning. That's not his view. And there he draws on all of the resources available to him, including Heidegger. I think we can see in these compact formulations a latent richness that far exceeds any overly simplistic notions we might have at the outset of what to expect from the theme of the study of the horizons of civilizations. And our impression of a latent richness, if you share that impression, will only be strengthened once we review the three rules that Dugin says will guide the composition of his geosophical map. So I propose now, in the time we have remaining together, to go through those rules And that will take us to the end of this final session. You allow me this sort of Straussian joke here for the benefit of the counters among you. I mention here in advance the fact that the second of these three rules concerns Heidegger and is itself subdivided into 7 parts. Okay, I am now quoting Dugin. The rules we intend to be guided by in the composition of our geosophical map are as follows. 1. We naturally do not claim to present any complete and detailed description of the logoi of all different cultures, which is even theoretically impossible. We consider the very notion of a cultural logos or logos of a given culture, i.e. the logos of a people, religion, society, or civilization, to be a projection of the 3 universal vertical logoi onto a given horizon, whose complex nature we've already emphasized. Thus, the horizontal logos, the logos of a civilization, is unpacked in these 3 vertical noological vectors. In other words, every concrete culture is a most complex code consisting of 3 fundamental elements. So that's rule 1. It's just a restatement, I would say, a compact restatement of something that we've already covered. But I think it's important to emphasize that the complete and detailed description is theoretically impossible. Now we go to point 2, which is going to be the longest of them. And as I indicated, has a subdivision of 7. So let's just start with what he writes. Secondly, between all the different criteria for culture and intellectual expression, we primarily aspire to emphasize and take into consideration the existential dimension. Such a conceptualization is founded on the theory of the plurality of Daseins, which we have outlined in our other works, first and foremost, those dealing with Martin Heidegger. And again, I say here off the notes that if you have an interest in Dugin's theory of the multiplicity of Heidegger, some of which I'm going to talk about here, but if you want to know where it gets developed in more detail, the second Heidegger volume is not translated. I'm working on it now. But if you look up me and my writings on Dugin's Heidegger, I think that is the richest available source in English to date, as far as I know. I hope better works are produced by other people before too long. But that's the, I think, most detail you'll find in English on how Dugin conceives of the plurality of Daseins, if you look at my essays on that topic. And also in the volume called, the collected volume called Russia in Heidegger, Heidegger in Russia and Eastern Europe. There's an entry there by Dugin that I translated on plural anthropology, which is also a good primary resource available in English. So again, he says, let me just restate that for emphasis, that we're emphasizing the existential dimension, and this conceptualization is founded on the theory of the plurality of Daseins. This means that we believe that the basic phenomenological level of the quote-unquote thinking presence of man in the world, the basic phenomenological level, differs in its deepest roots. And this difference is the foundation upon which the structures of culture, society, philosophy, politics, knowledge, science, and art are built. There are theorists, I say here parenthetically, there are theorists, cultural theorists, political theorists, philosophers who do not think that we need to trace cultural and social differences or our own knowledge and the nature of reality and all of that. They do not think that we need to root it in some deep fundamental dimension. In fact, they may reject the endeavor as foolhardy. They may play instead with, to give the name of Richard Rorty and some of his basic conceptions here of irony, because everything is ironic because there is no reality, so you can treat it ironically. Everything is contingent because nothing is necessary. And that type of approach is very distant from Dugin's here. He's talking about the foundations, the roots, getting all the way into the very basis of as deep as we can go, rooting cultural, societal, philosophical, political, scientific, and aesthetic differences on this level of the plurality of Daseins. I mean, again, if we treat that ourselves suspiciously, we could play with it as a metaphor or language game, but we've been approaching Dugin with philosophical empathy and therefore trying to understand him as he understands himself. So I continue now with the passage. We consider the Dasein of each civilization in its approach to death to be unique. And it is this existential plurality, that means every civilization faces death differently, and it's this existential plurality that determines differences in secondary significations and configurations. Well, we're about to go into the 7-point list here that follows right after that sentence, but in Heidegger's analysis in Being and Time of the being for whom being is a question, Dasein, which we talked about in session 1, you can review it if you'd like. In Heidegger's analytic of Dasein, or analysis of ourselves, our being towards death is a crucial component that helps give us our self-understanding and that helps configure a world for us. Well, Dugin says, and there's a great passage in one of his writings where he says he discussed this point with an eminent and foremost Heideggerian and scholar of Heidegger, that each people, culture, or civilization has its own being towards death. And on that basis, that maybe the door opens up a crack there into the possibility of a plurality of Daseins, if that can be established and if that can be rooted as a multiplicity of modes of being towards death in an analytic of Dasein. Well, okay, Dugin doesn't get into the details here, and I could do no more than just to emphasize them in case they pass by without notice. So I'm going to repeat that last sentence and then go into the 7 points. We consider the Dasein of each civilization in its approach to death to be unique. And it is this existential plurality that determines differences in secondary significations and configurations. Point 1. At the heart of every civilization lies a special quote-unquote thinking presence, Dasein. So at the heart of every civilization is a Dasein. This Dasein determines the structure of a given civilization's logos. That is to say, it lies at the basis of the metaphysics which can subsequently be built upon the root structure of the Dasein. So we already have the idea here that these 3 logoi, at their basis, when we combine the horizontal dimension, the Dasein determines the structure of a given civilization's logos. It lies at the basis of that civilization's logos. Okay. Point 3. Dasein is responsible for both the basic structure of the logos that is a result of its unfolding, as well as this logos' transformation over the course of the whole cycle of a civilization's historical being. So Dasein determines both the original configuration and its dynamism. We can see this, he says, still in point 3, in Heidegger's analysis of the Ontohistory, or Seinsgeschichte, the being historical trajectory of Western civilization. Remember, from the pre-Socratics to Nietzsche, all of that is an expression of Western Dasein. It has its own dynamism. It is historical. Therefore, it configures a civilization's history. And we can also see it in Henri Corbin's concept of the historial, which we've emphasized repeatedly. And I understand that Corbin used the word historial to translate Heidegger's Seinsgeschichte when he was the first to translate fragments of Heidegger into French. Point 4. The plurality of Daseins can be postulated both outside of a concrete civilization as an other Dasein, as well as with certain nuances within it. So there's a plurality of Daseins externally and internally, with certain nuances. Accordingly, he writes, in Mediterranean civilization, Hellenic, Roman, as well as Egyptian, Semitic, Chaldean, and Anatolian poles were all present, as are Germanic, Celtic, Latin, and other poles present within European civilization. Each of these poles can be analyzed on the basis of its existentials. And I remind you, again, that existential is a technical term from Heideggerian philosophy describing the structures of the being that we are, a being which is distinct from other types of being in the world. And again, Dugin has done some of that for the Russian Dasein by doing the analytic of Dasein in the Russian language. And here he's indicating that he thinks that can be done with all of these other units or poles as well. Point 5. From the point of view of Noomakhia, the logos of a given civilization, even in the form of its own inter-civilizational versions, can be subjected to spectral analysis with the aim of identifying the proportions between the three fundamental types of noology, the logos of Apollo, the logos of Dionysus, and the logos of Cybele. Okay, noetic spectral analysis, the proportions of which can theoretically differ in any possible manner within any given civilization. Point 6, hypothesis. The differences in the concrete spectral structure of the logoi of civilizations must be rooted in the differences of their root foundations in their Dasein. I happen to think that's probably the most interesting hypothesis, but that presupposes my personal interest in Heidegger and in Dugin's Heideggerianism. You may find many other aspects of Dugin's thought that you want to run with or run away from. But this hypothesis that the differences in the concrete spectral structure of the logoi of civilizations must be rooted in the differences of their root foundations, their Daseins, as far as hypotheses go, not a bad one. Okay, point 7. Thus, on the basis of a, on the basis of a Heideggerianism that has been expanded in all directions, and on the basis of Heideggerianism's experience of the destruction of Western European metaphysics and the Western European historial, so we accept Heidegger's distancing of ourselves from that first history of philosophy, treating in all of its richness and all of its significance, not passing over it, but doing the philosophical labor together with Heidegger to get to this point, that completion of the first episode of philosophy in the West and the possibility of another philosophy, at the same time as this broad expansion in all directions of Heideggerianism. On that basis, we can develop a methodological foundation for building a plural anthropology and a geosophical map of civilizations where the logos of each civilization corresponds to a special Dasein. On these grounds, we can correlate the model of Heidegger's existential analysis of the history of the Western logos with those of other philosophies and civilizations. And here too, Henri Corbin is an important figure for him because he was both Heideggerian and used existential phenomenology for the study of Islamic mysticism. So you have the ability there of bridging into a different world on the basis of this possible homology. So on these grounds, we can correlate the model of Heidegger's existential analysis of the history of the Western logos with those of other philosophies and civilizations, not to accept this as universal, but with the aim of seeking those possible homologies or, on the contrary, differences, which by virtue of the developed state of studies on European civilization and the relatively underdeveloped state of other civilizational studies might turn out to be extremely useful and substantive. It has been revealed in practice, Dugin writes, referring to his own second Heidegger book, Martin Heidegger, The Possibility of Russian Philosophy, that when speaking of Dasein, Heidegger was in fact dealing with the European, Indo-European, Hellenic, Apollonian, and Germanic Dasein. The Russian Dasein looks significantly different. And it's completely obvious that the Russian logos, when we try to reconstruct its main features, should also look completely different. For that explains to us the differences between civilizations and justifies those intuitions as to the uniqueness and originality of Russian civilization advanced by the Slavophiles, Danilevsky, the Eurasianists, Spengler, and many other authors. So he thinks this idea that Russia is somehow distinct from the West gets its justification, existential, ontological, philosophical justification in the proof, at least the compelling account, of the possibility of Russia's Dasein distinctness offered in that book. It is only obvious that such differences should also be found in the existential structure of the thinking presences or Daseins of other civilizations as well. Accordingly, the Heideggerian methodology for studying Dasein, ingeniously applied by Heidegger himself to his own civilization, can, given appropriate corrections and generalizations, be successfully applied to other civilizations, as the first approximation in the study of Russian Dasein has shown. The logos of Dionysus, to which phenomenology indeed corresponds, Dugin writes here, because remember, the Dionysian is phenomenological. It's, I think you remember that discussion. It is, in a certain sense, intermediary between the two other poles of Noomakhia. And so we can correlate the Dionysian logos with the middle or intermediary world, the horizontal section located strictly between the logos of Apollo and the logos of Cybele, between heaven and hell. Thus, we very well can begin precisely with this logos as the phenomenological starting point, fixing, and determination of a civilizational or cultural space. This does not mean that upon defining the zone of a concrete Dasein, we must stop there. So the Dionysian has somehow a privileged initial starting point for Dugin. It's interesting. Everything has its place. Remember, he said we need to first become Platonists before we get access to the other logoi, because in some sense it's through Plato that they acquire their significance. But the whole study, if it's founded on Heidegger, begins initially with the Dionysian. If Heidegger, as a phenomenologist and as someone who emphasizes himself the between, very much fits with the Dionysian. So it doesn't mean, though, that we must stop there. On the contrary, he says, we're faced with discerning the very structure of the correlation between the three logoi projected upon a given area, their balances and proportions. In other words, beginning or proceeding from an existential analysis, we try to reconstruct both the Uranic, Apollonian, celestial, and the Chthonic, maternal, and subterranean dimensions of the cultures under examination. Of course, he says, in some cases we will have to deviate from this application, such as if the Apollonian element or the Cybelean logos clearly predominate and clearly define the morphology of the Dasein. So it's sort of like you begin with the methodological presupposition that access to the cultural civilizational Dasein is through the Dionysian, but you with the necessary modifications and deviations. One example, he says, is the strictly Apollonian Iranian logos, or conversely, the Titanic logos of the Semites, in which the intermediary Dionysian dimension is weak, secondary, or derivative. That completes point 2. Remember, the 3 rules of the study of Geosophy. So we just completed the second rule about the importance of Heidegger and the priority of the existential dimension. So now, point 3. We do not wish to pass any final judgments regarding the scale we have employed. We know some civilizations, he writes, such as the European and Russian, much better for a number of quite understandable reasons. And so it logically follows our more detailed description of their particular points, such as our discernment in the field of European civilization, of multiple versions of this Dasein, as he said, Celtic and so on, and their pronouncements in particular dimensions of the Dasein of the cultures of North and South America. In other words, he knows Europe better than some other civilizations and therefore can distinguish more relevant phenomena. We know much less about Asian and African cultures and the cultural circle of Oceania. So in examining them, we have restricted ourselves to rather approximate generalizations, a point which concerns our own cultural limitations and does not reflect any simplicity or schematics of the cultural worlds under examination. Incidentally, I add here that if there's some culture or civilization that you know particularly well and you find Dugin's project enticing and appealing, you could very well develop the Geosophy of that region, given your knowledge and given the methodologies that we've discussed here. In all of these regions, Asia, Africana, Oceania, and so on, they all present an astonishing ethnic, cultural, intellectual, and existential originality, and a most wealthy plurality, not only of shades, but also of colors, figures, thoughts, and theories. Or, as we can say, a true blossoming complexity. In order to correctly interpret the structures of a given civilization, we must deliberately, consciously refrain from projecting our ethnocentric views. We have a visitor today. We should turn to the phenomenology of philosophy, deconstruction, and a-perception. So that's what we discussed in the first seminar about how to distance ourselves from ourselves. We should turn to all of those methodologies of distancing to bracket our own ethnocentrism, which leads us to believe that the methods and criteria for evaluating our own civilization are a universal scale for interpreting all other cultures. And remember, Dugin himself says that he had to bracket his traditional Russian orthodoxy for this very reason. In contrast to the semantic structure of the ethnocentrum, which structures space, and departing from its exceptionalism and implicit superiority, we must consciously allow for the plurality and qualitative equality of ethnocentra. We must recognize every ethnocentrum to have the right to its own cultural topography, and we must share this topography. Remember, participant observation and all that. We must share this topography to the extent that we wish to conceptualize the roots of its existential structure. That's his third point. And again, just for the benefit of those of you who will be reading on after this session, after this seminar, when Dugin writes about the ethnocentrum and ethnocentrism, he's not just using words, that you're ethnocentric and so on. He has an 800-page book in Russian called Ethnosociology, which goes into some detail, as you can imagine, about what exactly an ethnocentrum is. What does it mean to be ethnocentric? How is ethnic society related to folk society, to the nation state, to civil society, global society, and even the post-society of mutants and cyborgs? And that's all available in English now because I translated that, and it's been published by Arctos in 2 volumes, one of which you see here, Ethnos and Society, and another one called Ethnosociology, The Foundations. So if this idea of the ethnocentrum is interesting to you, you may want to look at the ethnosociology books. But okay, the point is clear. We have to be willing to bracket our ethnocentrism. Dugin says he did it in his study. He invites us to do it. There is no properly conducted Noomakhia unless there is the philosophical empathy and the participant observation that requires us to have a distance from ourselves. And that is the third of the rules guiding the geosophical element of the Noomakhic methodology. So before we part ways, first of all, I want to thank you for your time and all of that, but I want to leave you once again with this passage from the introduction of the first volume, which we read and discussed in our first session. Wars between people, including even the most cruel and bloody, are but pale comparisons to the wars of the gods, titans, giants, elements, demons, and angels. And these in turn are but figures, illustrating even more formidable and profound wars unfolding in the mind, in the sphere of nous and its limits, in which the mind or intellect itself borders the zone of madness. Thus, everything is Noomakhia. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye.